Hi, this is Steve Carlson. Jeb Bush started this campaign season, and certainly this Republican campaign season, on a severe downward trend. And I believe this is what gave rise to the ascendancy of Donald Trump in that party as an independent candidate who's identifying as a Republican. I think he's a good Republican. If I was in the Republican Party, I would be like Trump. What started the downward trend in this campaign was not even immigration. Basically, it was the incompetence of Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush is pitiful. He was asked an obvious question. This question is central to the core of the American experience in the last decade, and it's called 9/11. And it was a terrible, miserable failure to allow 9/11 to happen. I don't care what Bill O'Reilly thinks, defending Bush. Bill O'Reilly's job is to be moderate, and he does a great job of being moderate. And I always like to hear a moderate point of view. But moderate is not centrist. Centrist means people who want common sense. They want to get to answers. And moderate just means trying to avoid any controversy. And here is a controversy. It's called 9/11. And what was the cause of 9/11? Now, Donald Trump has apparently upset Jeb Bush because, once again, just like when the reporters asked Bush about 9/11, he's equally clueless. And here he ventured to try to turn it into a strength. He says, my brother's great, and I'll be great too, because he kept America safe. But he didn't keep America safe. There was greater watchfulness after 9/11, and yes, we went on offense, and yes, that did defend us to some degree, and yes, Barack Obama indicates he's on the other side by almost every one of his actions and comments, and has blown America's sacrifices and put us at great risk. Nonetheless, what caused 9/11 in the first place was a lack of common sense. There were all kinds of clues. And this is not conspiracy theory. I'm not talking about whether the beams of the World Trade Center were laden with explosives to heat them to high temperatures so the building would come down. You know, conspiracy theories are a laugh a minute for liberals hungry for the national treasure, so they can burden the country and not help anybody, like Barack has done. But I'm saying there was information. So much information about the planned attacks on a number of sites, including the World Trade Center. And the World Trade Center had been hit before, so anybody who knew about terrorists realized that once they get in that far, they're going to come back until they succeed. That's like their philosophy. That becomes some kind of a mission for them, until someone gets status and props and prestige in the attempt to become the leader, supreme leader of the Muslim world, which always requires taking over a country. It's not just moderates. It requires people who can take over a country and dominate all the rest of the Muslims. But not only were there signs, there were repeat attacks on the World Trade Center. There was all this information of a plan, direct plans, exactly what they did. They've been flying planes into important meetings, or planning to, for years. And Bush knew this, and Condoleezza Rice knew this. Supposedly, she's the national security expert, somehow hand-selected by George Bush because George Shultz said she was smart and studied Russian. You know, like this should be a qualification to defend our national security. Well, she blew it, big time. There was so much information about the proposed plans and attempted plans to hit that World Trade Center again, that on August 6, 2001, more than a month before 9/11, she presented that to George W. Bush in a meeting in Crawford, Texas, and said this had come up so many times before, they saw this every month, and therefore it was dry and academic to them and did not demand attention or response. This is the woman, like her or not, and her efforts to achieve success, and she has done that to a large degree. But being successful does not guard our country. And right now we are still in grave danger because of her, and because of George Bush, and Trump says that Bush was the president on 9/11, and I add that she was the National Security Council director. She made all kinds of alterations, well documented by Richard Clarke, who's a counterterrorism expert. He didn't propose a law enforcement approach to terrorism, contrary to what the Washington Post and Jennifer Rubin say, and he had led the efforts to try to keep America safe by Bill Clinton and also other presidents before Clinton. And she shut all this down. And Cheney helped her. And they put their deputy secretaries of the departments, rather than the secretaries, in charge of protecting us, and they would have their monthly counterterrorism meetings. Before it had been the secretaries of every department of the government. Now, probably this indicates that Condoleezza Rice did not know what she was doing, or she could continue to lead the same teams on the same meetings with the same success. Unfortunately, Rice did a poor job. Cheney did a poor job, and Bush did a poor job. So this is 9/11 is really the touchstone of our national security issues. Before 9/11, which is still the greatest threat to our liberty today, there had been responsibility. And what Bush and Cheney and Rice did, shutting down the careful attempts which actually had stopped attempted terrorism, for instance, in Los Angeles, or people coming in from Canada, it had been stopped because they were on top of it. And yes, they shared international intelligence, and they took this very seriously. So here comes George W., and he allowed this to go on, this shutting down. This is what George Bush allowed to happen. And yes, now everybody's frantic, because first of all, people are against Trump. But secondly, they don't want Jeb Bush to fall out of the race, which I believe he will. Because then the independent Americans, and not the two duopoly parties, will now be in charge of the nation. And they don't want this. But this would give us a clean start. The parties are tearing this country apart, as I have said since 2010, when I first ran for Congress as an independent, that this country is veering from one extreme to the other, and is going to go into a ditch. We need to get it back on the road. As I said in 2014, the parties are the problem, and right now, the Republican Party is teetering. And they're teetering on Jeb Bush, and they're teetering on 9/11. Now, as I said, this is no conspiracy theory. This is good common sense. There had been previous attacks, there was traffic, there was a definite plan which had been carried out in Europe. They stopped a plan to fly a plane into one of the G8 conferences in Europe in about 2000, I believe. And this isn't a joke. And here's the next step. Where Bush took this election downhill was not because he was the brother of George W. or the son of George H.W. Who we have to say of George H.W., I believe that it was a bad mistake for our security leaving Saddam Hussein in power. We didn't have to hang him and behead him, but we should have taken him out of power once he attacked Kuwait so barbarically. And I can understand he needed access so he could ship his country's oil. And Kuwait had all the real estate on the ocean. I can understand that. Nonetheless, this is not acceptable. And if there was any role that April Gillespie, as the ambassador, another kind of Hillary Clinton figure in foreign policy, should have played, it should have been to immediately warn all the responsible, accountable American leaders that Saddam Hussein was about to attack, and this would be a big deal, or even that he might be about to attack. So we could get other people in there, human intelligence and signal intelligence, to prevent this, because it has been a disaster. And then Colin Powell, another disastrous mistake, leaving all the troops just sitting there in a no-fly zone while leaving this guy Hussein in power. And I understand that Hussein was or had been our ally because we did, even at that time, fear the spread of the Iranian Revolution. And Hussein and his military was a bane to Iran, and Iran was a bane to Iraq. And apparently it was a religious war to see who would lead the Muslim world, if you will. There's a Muslim world. There's a lot of countries where they basically eliminated all the competition and now feel that they are the dominant rulers, and no strong moves to democracy there. The strongest middle class was in Iraq. It could have been because of our support and because of their oil, including our buying everybody's oil. We buy everybody's oil. And this isn't about oil, but oil's in the middle of it. Energy's in the middle of it. And therefore, our economic prospects are in the middle of it because economy requires energy. With the issues of national security and security and stability in the Middle East, as I said at the outset, Jeb Bush let down the country at the very beginning of the campaign, because I believe that if he, the son of H.W. and brother of George W., and maybe that's what's happening. It's sort of like The King's Speech. Have you seen that movie? He was the son of a king and the brother of a king, and Jeb kind of stammered there at the beginning of this election because the press asked him whether it had been a mistake to go into Iraq. Now, how big of a question is this? Well, it's a big question because not only does it go to our defense against 9/11, and I disagree with Bill Riley, 9/11, Bill O'Reilly, it wasn't just a bad mistake that happened because of faulty intelligence, blah, blah, blah. That is horsepucky. 9/11 was a failure of leadership. We have a failure of leadership before 9/11, and I would say that George W. Bush was responsible for that. And we've had a failure of leadership since 9/11, and Barack Obama has certainly outdone George W. for bad leadership. And this is a major, major problem right now. And if we went into Iraq when we should not have, that means there was something else that we could have done to defend ourselves against what 9/11 represented. For it's clear that this is not a single issue of a single one-time event. This is an issue of many warring factions in the Middle East, each vying to get control of their oil-producing countries and introduce what they feel would be a golden age for Islam. They swear that they're peaceful people. But the problem is that, first of all, this road, it's sort of like communism. Communists say down the road the state will wither away. And maybe the Muslims are saying all this bad stuff that they advertise and carry out will wither away when they take power. I've actually heard this said to me. But the fact is that all this bad stuff is in the Quran. I've seen it. It's in their law books. And it says that, see, I think this is kind of unlike a Christian. A Christian says, you get saved, and then that's between you and God. That's the Protestant philosophy. There's not even a need for a church organization to control you because you will follow God. Now, a lot of us fail in that, and it's very difficult to do. And I certainly respect the opinions in almost every case of the Catholic experts in church doctrine, because they and evangelicals, as far as the actual faith, within their communities, there's no greater advocate for protecting human life. I don't think the Muslims quite get it. But they and most of their faiths would be against the taking of innocent unborn people's lives. But they also fail. And so the church, even Muslims, in terms of their actual faith, may achieve morality among themselves. However, to the outsiders, what the Muslims call infidels, and I have news, infidel does not mean non-Muslims. Now, Christians do not usually use the word infidel because they don't go after other people for being infidels. But we Christians have a faith, and if Muslims do not believe in our faith, then they are the infidels, okay? Now, I'm not trying to start a finger-pointing contest of who's an infidel. This is the weakest part of this Muslim hope that somehow they will dominate all infidels. And let's be honest, they don't really want to just eliminate all infidels. No, quite the contrary. They want infidels to be kept around as slaves and as inferior second-class citizens, so that to them being allowed into the Muslims is a kind of an honor, a privilege, even to some extent for their women. They are supposed to be trusted to treat all women and children well. As I said, they fail. And I'll tell you this right now. We need, each one of us, we need God in our lives every day, or else we fail. And the failure rate has gotten so high right now that the very foundations of the nation are in peril. And that peril had a connection to 9/11 in George W. Bush. I recognized that George W. changed his ways, his youthful ways of a riotous, cajoling past. But he changed his ways with the help of his wife and had a conversion, and no doubt God was the biggest influence in his life, because his influences before that, as the black sheep of the family, were not good. And I believe that God did lead him on a path to a better life, and I truly hope that he continues to follow it. But he did not do an able, competent job to defend us. And you know, if there's some meaning in this, it is that military might is not going to do it. A change of heart is in order. W changed to become more of a leader. take on some responsibilities, the best that he could, so help him God. But there was a difficult path there. And I, for one, do not believe that the laws should have been applied to Florida in Bush v. Gore as they were to stop the recount. That is because, as I have said, in my case currently pending in the Supreme Court against Al Franken, awaiting Governor Dayton's answer, it is through Article 1, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution that there is a broad grant of authority given to the states to elect representatives and prescribe the manner thereof. Now, that's Article 1 that affects the congressional races, but I think it should be read in pari materia with the presidential election requirements, unless the framers were clear that it should be different. And of course, a lot of this came along with the direct vote for president and the U.S. senators, and that was not there in the original Constitution. But the 14th Amendment should not have been applied as it was. Bush v. Gore stands as another one of the 14th Amendment travesties. You've got now Obergefell that struck down marriage in the states because they're not allowed to define it. And who knows what the future justices like Anthony Kennedy will read into the 14th Amendment. And then you've got the Anchor Baby case, which is obviously ridiculous. The citizenship question of Mexican Americans has been clearly addressed by the Congress in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So Donald Trump's people suggested further action might be taken to clarify that citizenship question in the 14th Amendment. Well, it shouldn't have to be taken because that treaty with Mexico defined citizenship as those former Mexican nationals who stayed in the U.S. 1 year after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was ratified. And that should not be gainsaid by an opinion at the Supreme Court. So to the extent that the 14th Amendment allowed Congress to define citizenship and all other questions, in the 14th Amendment, they had already defined it. There was nothing in the 14th Amendment that everything that had already been defined needed to go through a whole new process. So Bush v. Gore was another travesty, and I'm sure there are a number of other problems in the 14th Amendment, because it's very troubling, because it takes power from the states and gives that power to the Congress, just as in Obergefell, even they were allowed to bypass the Congress and go straight to the judges who are mistakenly appointed, mistakenly because they refuse to apply the law and Constitution. And so, in the same manner, Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution gives the Congress the power to modify the manner of the elections in federal officials, being the Congress. And in this case, they should have followed the prescribed rules and not set up special judicial interests after the election and the vote was being counted. Another strong argument why the election of the president should be read in pari materia with the election of Congress is that traditionally Congress plays a strong role itself in the choosing of the president in close cases. They actually choose them when there's a problem coming out of the Electoral College. And so the point here is that when Bush was selected in Bush v. Gore, is actually the direct result of the Civil War, because it was in that war that it motivated to Congress to push through the 14th Amendment. And I want to say that they pushed so hard that they threw out the legislatures of 3 different southern states who had refused to ratify it and put in their own legislature, the radical Republicans' own legislatures, that they then agreed to ratify the 14th Amendment. This is where this came from and why it's so troubling. Now, this is a very troubled system, and that troubled system continues, and independent voters need to pay attention to this. To conclude, regarding the U.S. entry into the Iraq War, if Jeb Bush could not give an answer as to why his brother and his dad each went into Iraq, then he's not qualified to be president. He's not serious. And he cannot attack Donald Trump because someone asked him about the responsibility of a president of the U.S. when you have incidents like 9/11 and the follow-up. I feel that war was correct, but it was necessary because of the unfinished business left by Colin Powell and George H.W. Bush. And I know political decisions are very difficult. Now, we went in there to finish because we could not attack a faceless terrorist enemy who was in fact linked to Saddam Hussein, through this network of Muslim armies that are inimical to the United States. And they are inimical, and 9/11 proved that. And they've continued to prove it through further acts of terrorism. Now, if we were wrong, then we have the problem and all the untold American deaths and Muslim deaths, and so that is what we have to face all throughout the Middle East. Now, if this was not necessary by Cheney and Bush's brother, then we have had senseless slaughter. Now, that is not a reason to choose that it was justified. But this is not an election question. This is not a question where Jeb Bush and the other Republican candidates, including Ted Cruz, are free to play around. This is our national security. But it's also a worldwide calamity. And if they are truly responsible, as Jeb Bush, in order to get elected, is saying, for this kind of wrong decision, that just because Colin Powell comes up with some baloney about seeing part of a nuclear weapon in a photograph at the United Nations, then they should never be in office again, frankly. I think this is one reason why they're being so frantic, because they realize this. On the other hand, I do not agree with Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders that we should not have gone in. I do not agree, first of all, that there were no weapons of mass destruction, because there was nerve gas, chemical weapons, which are weapons of mass destruction. We did not know how those would play out. We'd just been attacked. We see right now that people will come into the United States and use these weapons of mass destruction against us. But the defense of our country in the middle of this terrible terrorist attack, with apparent support from several Islamic states in the region, called for a response. And the most sensible one was the one that we followed in Iraq and in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But the military footprint in Iraq, I believe now in hindsight, was too small, because we never really controlled the country outside of Baghdad. And what we now see, and it would have been helpful if more people like the Washington Post or somebody had informed us of this, because I did not know it at the time clearly, that if you just kept the city of Baghdad, everybody would fight over the city, and the sectarian struggle between the denominations within Islam would eventually threaten to tear that country apart. It's not a question, as Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and Joe Biden say, that, well, they should all just get along. These questions are big. They're big for Muslims. And you can't just say, well, let's play nice like good boys and girls. We need a much more intelligent diplomacy and leadership on this. And so I don't agree with Trump. I don't agree with Sanders. We needed to defend ourselves. Yes, we risked instability, but the answer should have been a bigger footprint. Rumsfeld was in the end wrong, as difficult as it is. I'm Steve Carlson, and I'm running as an independent for president, and I approve this message.